Hi, I am Chad Anderson of Filmmaker U, filling in for Gordon Burkell. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify their skill set. You can learn more on filmmakeru.com or follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_u. Every week we interview a film professional, and this week we are pleased to be joined by production designer James Philpott, whose work includes episodes of Smallville, Bones of Crows, The Hundred, and most recently, my new favorite show, Death and Other Details. I've just watched it. I'm falling madly in love with it. Welcome to the show, James.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to ask, in terms of becoming a production designer, what was the avenue that led you into this process, into doing this work? Where did you come from? It seems like some people come from different areas of art or design or construction or whatever it may be. How did you make your way into becoming a production designer?
Well, that's an interesting question because it wasn't necessarily something that was a planned journey. I have done a lot of studies in different sort of fields of art. I mean, obviously, I study art and art history in university, and then I kind of dabbled in a couple different artistic fields. I sort of did fashion design briefly, but I went into architecture and I studied architecture. And when I graduated from architecture, one of the avenues that people were suggesting to me was that the opportunities of working in art departments for film. And I thought, well, that sounded very interesting. So I put out a bunch of applications, and within like literally a week, I had a job, and it just sort of took off from there. But definitely, it was the architectural background that really kind of was the starting point in my journey in the art department. So I essentially worked from a set designer, and then not that far along, I went art director and then eventually production designer. So that's sort of how my journey came about. But as I said, it wasn't planned. Just
Was there a plan? Was there, in terms of architecture work, was that you were going to be like a home architect or a building architect? Was there something that you had like in the back of your head was going to be the idea?
Well, I think when I studied architecture, I mean, I think the initial idea is that I would become an architect. So that was kind of the plan. But then um, and I find that this happens to a lot of people who graduate from design schools, is that you realize that your skill set has so many more applications. And then people start saying, well, maybe you should look at this or you should look at that. And then it ended up those elements clicked. And that's sort of how the journey became.
I got into sound designing at a point when things were just developing. I was really fascinated by the idea that dialogue, effects, and music were all components of the soundtrack to a film, which had never occurred to me before. What gets me excited is coming up with sound ideas that do match picture, but also is not just the equivalent of what you're seeing on screen. I'm Eugene Garrity, and this is my course on sound design.
I teach at a college, and I always talk about this with students, the idea that there's kind of this weird future out there that's sort of almost already been planned for you in terms of, your future of what your job's going to be there. And some people think like, oh, I'm going to be a camera operator, I'm going to be an audio engineer, I'm going to be a music producer. And then next thing you know, they're working in commercial work, or they're working in post work, or they're working somewhere else that they never encountered, never imagined to work, but just the chips fell into place and now they've fallen madly in love with it. So it's kind of, I'm excited for you in terms of that aspect of it.
Well, that is what happens. And I think sort of like one of the things when you're in different professional schools or different types of schooling is that really what you think the end goal is when you're in the course is not necessarily what the end goal is in your life. And there's way more opportunities out there for different things than you're led to believe. And then that's sort of where you start to find them.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you've worked on several episodes of the 100. I'm looking at about 71 episodes.
What?
Um,
Yes, that was a few. Yeah, a few. I've worked
yeah,
on.
Smallville, several seasons of that.
Yes.
And then there were some shows that you did as kind of a smaller endeavor, kind of like a one-off or a two-off, or did a couple episodes here or there.
Yes.
What was the difference between those decisions, and how were those decisions made in terms of, hey, I'm going to work on this for a couple episodes versus I'm going to work on this for several seasons. I'm going to find this place in that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that kind of drove some of those. So obviously, opportunities, of course, one of the reasons why one would work in different longevities. But one of the things that was interesting when I worked in Smallville, it was a long running show. It was also a multiple, like 22 episode series. And it sort of basically kind of ran into itself, that you would do a season, there would be a small break and not long enough to do another project, and then you would just sort of go into the next season. When I did the 100, it was a little bit different because it was a 13 to 16 episode series, and so the sort of breaks ended up being much longer, and I had the really great fortune of being able to do a whole series of pilots, which actually I thought was very good, because not only was it a palate cleansing, but it also gave me the ability to really stretch out my artistic talents, also dabble in different genres, and really sort of give more breadth to the sort of the work that I've done. And so that is sort of how that kind of difference between a whole series of shorter projects that were generally more pilots rather than series. And I would often go back to the 100. I would be kind of on loan in a way. So that would be kind of how that kind of transpired.
Are you working on multiple shows at once, or are you dedicated to a single show throughout the
I,
season?
I do one show at a time. I mean, I think the sort of scope and breadth of what production designers do is so vast. The idea of doing multiple shows, I don't even know how someone would be able to do that.
Yeah,
Um, and uh, and I don't think that most people do that. I think in a course of a year, you may do multiple shows, but it's one at a time.
sure. Sure. Do you find with a show like with the 100 or say Smallville, over the seasons, does it get easier or does it get harder to do? I'm wondering if it gets easier because you've done this before, and this is, becomes kind of like just going to work, and you kind of get into a process of how to do it, or do the sets and design and everything else become more elaborate, and therefore you're putting more effort into as you go on with each season?
Well, it really depends on the show. Um, I mean, obviously, as the more you do something, the more that you become used to it, and also you become more proficient, and then becomes easier from that point of view. But I do also think that shows always are evolving, and it always is, there's sort of design challenges that are ahead of you, so that it creates sort of interest. But you're always having to put a fair amount of energy into whatever you do. On the 100, we had a scenario where often there would be all these sort of apocalyptic events, and the whole world would explode or something like that. So in some ways, you were always kind of continually reinventing the show, and that particular show seemed to get bigger and bigger every time. So in some ways, as much as you become proficient with the job and you kind of know what you need to do, the challenges become bigger. So it's, I mean, it's a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. I mean, it's very exhilarating to get bigger and do more things and do cool things, but obviously it's a challenge and it's a learning experience as well. And um, it takes quite a bit of energy, but in a
Sure.
good way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm fascinated with this Death and Other Details. I just watched
Yep,
the first couple episodes this week. I've fallen madly in love with it, and now I've told everyone I know about it. It's
fabulous.
it's visually stimulating. It's just amazingly done. Was there a tone that was given to you by the producers about what they were looking for? How did you approach this, and what did you, in terms of style, in terms of tone, what were you going for?
Well, I mean, the thing is that in terms of what the tone and the style of the show is obviously the hope was that we would sort of create a modern version of a classic Agatha Christie mystery. And that I think started sort of the tone right there, because obviously there's a whole kind of almost history of that type of murder mystery. And then by putting it onto this Art Deco ocean liner, it sort of set a new, that's a very specific tone, because stylistically those ocean liners had a very specific aesthetic. And I have to say, one of the things in my job as a production designer, I get to do a lot of research, and I find that really exciting. And I mean, the designs and the aesthetic of the time period of the 1930s was so interesting because there were so many different influences coming in. There was like sort of traditional, sort of polished woods and brasses, but then they'd have like super modern graphic floors and you know, a lot of cubist art. So there was a lot of like very interesting design elements in there. And there were so many different ships to look at. And I mean, it was actually quite interesting because there was almost like design competition during that time period where every different shipping company would want to design a more beautiful ship, and they'd advertise this is the most beautiful ship, and there would be like this sort of one-upmanship. So that sort of created the design tone and sort of just the luxuriousness of what the ship and the sets were supposed to be. And I mean, in the pilot episode, we did have the good fortune of shooting at the Queen Mary, which of course is one in Long Beach, which is of course one of the great ships of that time period. So that sort of set a bit of an aesthetic tone, but also there is a sort of a tone of the color palette and just keeping the on a lighter, more colorful note, not bright colors, but very like lush and luminous colors, just to keep the energy of the mystery, and the energy of how the people are, and also to tie it in with this sort of really gorgeous, gorgeous fashion that my colleague Mandy Line brought forward. And obviously we had a really good synergy there too, to make sure everything always kind of aligned, and that's sort of how we kind of worked our way through there.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, I mean, the pilot was interesting because there is that we talk about the Art Deco style of it. There is that the Art Deco style of the bars and of the rooms and pretty much everything. But there's a typical note to that, and I forget with the behind the bar they make reference to this painting or sculpture, that art piece there, and so they are kind of illustrating or kind of bring attention to this is the style of this time period, and it kind of sets it in terms of a tone.
Yes, yes. I mean, there definitely was in the script and a whole storyline that this ship represented sort of the beautifulness of the past. This sort of in dialogue, there was reference that nothing was to be on the ship that was like after 1955, and they really wanted to sort of create this luxurious world of this sort of golden glamour, and that the cruise what is sort of designed for a collection of essentially one percenters, and that they were going to sort of live in this glamorous world that sort of in some ways kind of counterpoints the sort of ugliness of the world we have now. And I think that actually is in I think one of the characters, Teddy, says that actually in the pilot. And so that's also tonally something we really wanted to look at, is that everything was supposed to be very, very beautiful, and everything had to be examined on our part from that lens.
Yeah, there is also this kind of subplot of kind of a class war. There's the difference between Imogen, who didn't come from money, and these other people, Trip, for example, who came from a lot of money and obviously has the silver spoon in his mouth, kind of mentality. There is this kind of this ship has to be in an image of what you imagine wealth to be like. There's these $6 billion trades and all this kind of
Yes.
high business kind of mentality.
Yeah, and I mean, there's definitely in the show there is sort of a very stratified class system, because not only with the sort of the passengers that are in the staterooms, and that's something that we looked at too, is that I mean, there are a number of very super lush, beautiful staterooms, like where the Collier family is, and Anna Collier's suite and the Chung suite. I mean, very, very gorgeous, big and lush suites. And then we would have sort of lesser suites like that our character, the Ugly American, and would be in, uh, and then Imogen sort of is more of a room, and so that we did sort of place certain people in certain rooms for to sort of to reflect their status. But also the other thing that we start to get into in these episodes is we also start to go into the lower decks where the crew are as well. And there was sort of the idea of what that looks like, and definitely trying to sort of sell there's a difference between what the crew experiences versus what the passengers experience. And then we also go into the sort of innards of the ship in episode 3, and which which has aired, so I think we're good there. And
I haven't
uh
seen it yet. I haven't seen it yet, so
okay, but we do explore a lot of parts of the ship, and like all different parts of the ship have sort of different places in the story, and also there is a reflection of the sort of class levels in the ship as well as in the story.
you mentioned the Queen Mary. My presumption was that most of this work was done on a soundstage. Was in terms of location versus soundstage, what's the relationship in terms of this show, but in terms of your work, and what you prefer?
Well, I mean, basically this show, I mean, the Queen Mary was part of the pilot episode, but when we went to series, the majority of the ship did end up in, as you said, a soundstage, and it was built. All the suites and the various elements were on a soundstage. We did do in some location work on this particular show, particularly when we would go into some of the backstories, which I'm not going to tell you more about because I mean, I think we've seen a few, but we haven't seen them
Yeah.
all. Um, and that was really interesting because obviously we had an aesthetic that the overall show was working with, and we would look at different of those elements that would conform into the global idea. I mean, in terms of other shows that I've worked on, I think you mentioned I did this indie feature called Bones of Pro, and
Mhm.
that was almost all location work where we would adapt the locations to fit all the different time periods. So that is almost the exact opposite of what Death and Other Details are. The Hundred, I mean, we did have a lot of locations, but they were all built elements. So, I mean, all the sort of post-apocalyptic cities and villages and towns were built on locations. So that I would say that was almost the kind of a hybrid. So, I mean, it really depends on the show. It depends on the aesthetic of the show. I mean, how much of a high concept the show might be. And in some ways, even when you go to locations, it's still about editing in the sense of what you see versus what you don't see. And it's amazing how things look so different on screen than they do in real life when you say, well, this is what we're seeing and we're not seeing that, and suddenly you think it's somewhere totally different.
So I'm always interested in invisible visual effects. You're doing the production design work, but you're also working with the visual effects crew to create things. And there's an interesting relationship of where, you may want to build something, but a green screen may behind it may cover those kind of things. How did that work on Death and Other Details? Like, where were the parts that you found that were more, hey, I'm going to design this versus, I don't imagine you took an ocean liner out 600 feet above and shot that. That was all 3D.
Well, I mean, one of the big focuses that I had was obviously building sets and building the interiors and building the elements. So obviously the ship was part of that sort of whole idea of designing what the ocean liner was going to be. And so from my point of view, it's like well, anything else, we built and designed the ocean liner, and we also worked with the visual effects company who built the ocean liner exterior that you see, and we worked very closely with that group. In fact, um, at the end, we would essentially we took their work and we would kind of redid it all, and to make sure all the details of our ship was matched to that, and anything that we felt we needed to change or conform to the design aesthetics that we were working with, we worked with them, and we would well, literally take pieces and send it back.
That's
Say, this.
amazing. That's amazing to think about the fact that there's some, visual 3D art group putting together the actual exterior of the ship and putting together where the thing is, and then you're going in and being like, this room is here, and this room is here, and that room fits to that room, and there should be a hallway down the middle of this.
Mhm.
It's kind of fascinating.
Well, and also like things like windows and doors,
Sure.
and like you'll notice in there's a tennis court on the top of the ship, and I mean that's something we were like with our research. We said, oh, there's these really cool tennis courts, and we said we need a tennis court on our ship, and so that was something that kind of where it came from us.
In terms of budget, how much freedom do you have with budget? Because this is in terms of this show, it's just breathtaking. And I just I can't imagine that you cut a single corner in terms of trying to manage something. It feels like each episode feels like a big film production, and it feels like $1 billion production. And I try to figure out how you handled that.
Well, I mean, obviously, budget is always a sort of a touchy topic, and there's also give and take with everything. Um, so one of the things that obviously I want to do is maximize every single cent that we have. And so there are areas that, believe it or not, we did sort of maybe not cut corners, because it's really important for me for that show that we didn't cut any aesthetic corners, but we did do things where we would uh, maybe reuse sets. Like some of the suites would be the same suite, but we would change components within it architecturally. We would often redress each of the suites with new furniture, so that we can kind of maximize sets, so that not necessarily everything was just a one purpose element, that sometimes some sets would be repurposed for 2, 3, and even 4 times, just to give the sort of whole breadth of the show. Um, and then there were other times, and I mean, I probably that we, and I'm not going to get too specific in it, because I'm not sure if this would fall into spoilers, but I mean, we did also maximize using the architectural elements of our actual stages. So there would be certain spaces that we would go into, and we would retrofit them, just to it basically maximize the whole well, we maximize the whole stages by using every square inch, but we also use the buildings in different ways, and different parts of the ship are, you know, part of that building in some ways. And we would make it work within the look, but it was also trying to make this much bigger than even we would necessarily have resources for. And that's part of the thing I like to do, is that, like, I'm happy you say it seems like $1 billion
Yeah,
prize.
because it has to match the level of wealth that the
Yes.
Collier family has, and so it can't be, it's fake, but it can't look fake. It needs to look as real as
Yes.
possible.
That was something we definitely wanted to achieve, and it was something we discussed quite early on. I mean, that was the mandate from day one, is that this had to look like luxurious, one percenter, and it also had to look. I had to have that beautiful like Art Deco vibe, but it also had to read luxurious for a present day sort of wealthy clientele as well. So there was just, we had to really kind of focus on, drill down on what that was.
Now, I heard there's a rumor of, or I heard a story of tearing down part of the soundstage wall to sneak in pieces of equipment or pieces of staging.
Yeah, so what we ended up doing is for some of our decks, our outer decks, and our 2-story sets, is that we would literally be building in into this stage, and in order to sort of bring in people and actors, we actually tore down many of the walls of our stage building, and we had a stage that was 52 feet tall, and it was adjacent to the rest of the structure of the building. And we would have doors on the second floor that would match doors on the second floor of the stage, and doors on the first floor that matched the first floor of the stage. And we would cut holes in the walls so that we could have people come in and out. And then obviously that was also designed so that we could get the equipment in. And it also helped us because we had an elevator in the building, and then the people were, the crew was able to bring the cameras and everything up on the elevator, and then they could come into upper levels of the set through the resources that the actual stage provided us, which was fun.
It reminds me a little bit of the old legend of Orson Welles making Citizen Kane, where he has to, axe into the floor so he gets the camera low enough so he can shoot upwards because he doesn't have a low enough angle because the camera doesn't go that low. You're basically tearing
Yeah.
apart your entire stage place to make it work.
Yeah, it wasn't, well, I was going to say it wasn't extreme as that, but kind of it was because we did tear a lot of stuff out. So, yes.
How much, in terms of producers, in working with producers, especially on this film, how much freedom do you find that they give you? How much freedom to say, I'm going to interpret this the way that I want to interpret this, and this is what I want to go for, and there's not like kind of a, and someone watching over you and saying, no, I want it this way.
Well, I mean, our showrunners, Mike Weiss and Heidi Cole McAdams, are very collaborative people. And I mean, obviously, we had many conversations about kind of the aesthetic that they liked and what the direction they felt the show would go in. But they were also very open when I would come back with them and say, okay, this is what I'm thinking based on, our conversations and my research and various different things. And obviously, sort of logistics of all sorts of um, elements that I have to deal with. And so I felt it was very collaborative, and it was very open for me to come back and sort of basically interpret the ideas that we had discussed.
Now, the last question I'm going to ask you is kind of a weird question. Do you have a guilty pleasure? Is there something that you watch, TV, movie, whatever, internet, at the end of the day that just kind of just relaxes your brain, kind of unplugs for a moment? Maybe something you're a little silly or whatever, that you love.
Yes, I do have, and for some reason it popped in my head today when I was driving around town. But there's these two Instagram accounts that I seem to be slightly obsessed with. And one is where there's sort of two or three daubs of paint, and they basically the person takes a knife and mixes new colors. And it just like I watch it over and over again, and it's always so like, wow, look at that color, and it's so fun. And it's very relaxing and sort of creative in a sense. And then the other one, which is even a bit weirder, is there's a Instagram account where a person darns woolen clothing, and they just sort of make holes. There's holes, and then they darn them, and they're invisible. And I'm just like dazzled at just the skill of these people. And so it's sort of very relaxing, and it's sort of a guilty pleasure, and it's sort of silly, but I like it anyways.
What's really nice about Instagram is the algorithm. Sometimes if you start watching things like that, you'll get in this next thing you know, you'll get all this stuff that comes into your feed. I get random stuff of people just building stuff like putting together shoes or learning how to make a table or learning how to laminate a floor. And I'm just watching somebody, repurpose a driveway and build stuff out of it. It's kind
I
of
love stuff like
it's
that.
mesmerizing. It's absolutely mesmerizing. James, thank you so much for joining
Thank
us.
you.
That will be it for us this week. You can check us out at filmmakeru.com or follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_you. I am Chad Anderson. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you again, James, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.